The briefing was already 40 minutes old when Gideon Marsh finally said yes, and the word came out of him like a tooth. Above the chandler's shop in Vigo Harbor, in a room that smelled of rope wax and old coffee, Director Ines Halloran slid the document across the table a third time, and this time he let his hand rest on it. 9 seals ran down the right-hand margin of the page, pressed in gray wax, each one the size of a thumbprint. The document was a copy. The original sat in a vault under the Sarin Concord's capital, and it had killed 6,212 human beings. "Read the finding first," Halloran said. "Then the instruction, in that order. I want you to feel the distance between them." The finding was 4 paragraphs long, stamped by the Concord's Bureau of Public Calm, and it said that on the night of first rain, an equipment fault in the environmental plant of the Harrogigant enclave on Veloa had triggered an automated decontamination burn. It said the fault was regrettable. It said the seals on the habitation ring had engaged as designed, that the superheated scrub had cycled through the air system for 11 minutes as designed, and that the design had never anticipated occupancy during a burn. It expressed sorrow in the passive voice. It recommended a review of maintenance schedules. It closed the file. The instruction was shorter. It was titled Vale 9. It was dated 6 weeks before the burn, and it ordered the Office of Stillness to render the Harrogate enclave permanently quiet by means that would survive an external audit. It specified the festival night because attendance would be total. It specified the burn because fire leaves arguments and scrubbed air leaves none. It allocated funds. It assigned an engineer, a station officer, a controller, a registrar, a field director, and down the margin, where Concord law required every executive instruction to carry the personal seal of every official who touched it, 9 officers of the Office of Stillness had pressed their names into the wax, one after another, in descending order of rank. Marsh read both pages twice. Outside, a crane swung a container over the harbor, and the evening light came through the shutters and bars. He had been retired 9 years. He repaired clocks now in a shop 2 streets up from this room, and his hands had finally stopped smelling of solvent and airports. He was 63 years old, and he had told himself, the day he handed in his cipher, that he would never again sit in a room like this one while someone laid dead people on a table like cards. 6,212, I said. Why does Earth need me? Earth has a fleet. Earth is building a fleet, Halloran said. Task Group Plumb Line. 2,200 hulls when it's finished, and it will sit on the Concord frontier, and it will not fire a shot until the day it can fire all of them at once, with the whole galaxy agreeing we were right to. That day is not today. Today the Concorde says it was a valve, and half the powers that matter find it convenient to believe them, and if we burn a Concord city tomorrow, we are the species that glassed a trading partner over an industrial accident. She tapped the 9 seals. First the account, then the settlement. You taught me that order 20 years ago in a worse room than this. I taught you to collect debts that could be collected quietly. This one will be collected quietly, just not forever. She leaned back. Here is the mandate, Gideon, exactly as the council signed it, and you will notice it is signed. 9 names are on that instruction. Earth wants every one of them brought to account, removed, taken, or broken, in whatever order the work allows. And Earth wants it documented. Every operation, every expenditure, every consequence, written down, receipted, and archived. No deniable ghosts. No vanished budget. The day the last seal is accounted for, the whole record goes to the tribunal and then to the public, theirs and ours. We are not hiding this. We are hiding it until it is complete. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. It was, he admitted to himself, the one shape of the thing he had no argument against. He had spent 30 years inside the deniable world, and he knew what deniability cost. It cost the truth its spine, and sooner or later it cost the operators their souls and the country its memory. A campaign that ended in publication was a different animal. It was a campaign that intended from its first hour to stand in daylight and be judged. Conditions, he said. I see every target package before any action, and I hold the veto, not your office. Nothing happens within reach of a child, theirs or anyone's. Every operation is costed in advance and receipted after, and I keep the ledger myself, the true one, including the entries your accountants won't have a column for. And when it is finished, I retire again, and this time you lose my address. Agreed. Halloran said too quickly, the way people agree when they have already decided to give you anything because they are asking you for everything. She left him the document and a key to the room. The paymaster arrived the next morning, a narrow, gray-eyed man of about 50 who gave the work name Quill and never afterward gave anything else, and who carried the funds in bonded drafts and demanded receipts the way other men demanded loyalty. Marsh found that he liked him almost immediately, which worried him. Men who liked their paymasters were men who had stopped asking where the money came from. He resolved to keep disliking Quill on principle. and failed within the week. The cell took 11 days to assemble, and Marsh chose every name himself from the long memory of his first life. Saskia Thiel, who had spent 15 years following money through the laundered guts of 3 economies and could read a balance sheet the way a tracker reads snow. Ivo Wren, who opened things, doors, vaults, networks, lies, and who had retired to a vineyard he was visibly relieved to abandon. Lena Pohl, who built people out of paper, whole lives with school records and tax arrears, and an aunt in a care home, legends so deep you could bleed them. Tomas Iskra, who lived inside the signal traffic of other civilizations like a fish in a reef. Dario Ferro, who had been a reconnaissance marine, and then a protection specialist, and then for one deniable decade, the thing nobody wrote a job title for. He came off a ferry in Vigo with one bag and asked no questions about the work, only about the rules. Nor Haddad, field medic and quartermaster, who had patched Marsh's people in 4 campaigns and buried 2 of them, and who looked at him on arrival and said, "You promised me you were done," and then put her kid on the table anyway. 7 with Marsh. Against an intelligence service 3 centuries old, with a counter-espionage arm, a doctrine, a college, and the patient confidence of an institution that had quietly arranged the politics of 40 species and never once been billed for it. "They're called the Office of Stillness," Marsh told them, the first night with the harbor dark below the shutters. Inside the Concord, they're called the Still, when they're called anything. Their doctrine is subtraction. They believe that history is noise, and that the wise governor removes the noisy element before it becomes history. 200 years ago, that meant an editor here, a shipping clerk there. The Harrogate Enclave was the largest human settlement in Concord space. 6,000 dockhands and brokers and teachers who had the bad manners to prosper, to multiply, and to vote their station council into demanding seats on the Velo Port Authority. The Still ran the arithmetic, humans in the ledger as a rising cost, so they subtracted us. He laid the false finding on the table next to the instruction with its 9 seals. They wrote this lie before they lit the fire. The lie was the point. A massacre that reads as maintenance teaches the whole Concord that humans can be deleted without consequence, that even our dying makes no sound. Earth's answer is going to be a sound. 9 seals. We will account for everyone, lowest to highest, and at every site we will leave a copy of their own finding so that the office understands exactly which lie is being returned to its authors. And when the 9th seal is accounted for, everything we did, everything including our mistakes, goes into the light with our names on it. That's the campaign. Costed, receipted, signed. If any of that is unacceptable to you, the ferry runs at 6. No one took the ferry. The campaign ledger was a physical book, gray cloth boards, 400 numbered pages, bought from a stationer in the Rua du Principe for 11 marks. The first entry, in Marsh's small slanted hand, was the book itself. He ruled each operation as a folio, and he numbered the folios in descending order, 9 to 1, because the seals ran downward and because he wanted the arithmetic of the thing visible every time he opened it. A countdown, not a tally. Quill approved of the book so thoroughly that Marsh almost abandoned it. Folio 9, Othel Dren, atmospheric engineer, Seal 9 of Instruction Veil 9, the man who designed the burn profile. Line items entered before departure, transit and legends for 4 operators, 2,100 marks. Lease of a maintenance launch at Careva Sound, 800. Diving equipment, instruments, consumables, 640. Local facilitation, 300. Contingency draw, 1,000. Projected total, 4,840 marks. Beneath the figures, in the column Quill's accounting would never see, Marsh wrote the first entry of the other ledger, the cost of beginning. Dren had left the office's engineering directorate 8 months after the burn, promoted out, the record said, to a consultancy on Careva, a resort moon of warm, shallow seas where the Concord's administrative class went to molt. Thiel found him in 4 days through the consultancy's billing. He was being paid a retainer 3 times the market rate by a holding company that dissolved upward into the office's unacknowledged budget. Hush money salted his salary. Wren and Iskra went in as marine systems contractors. Pohl built them a firm with 6 years of tax history. Ferro went in as a tourist because Ferro could make even that look like a profession. For 9 days, they watched the engineer of the Harrogate burn live his soft new life. He swam in the mornings. He kept a small submersible at a private dock and dove the reef shelf alone every 3rd day, with the punctuality of a man whose whole crime had been an exercise in scheduling. He was not guarded. The office had run its arithmetic on Dren, too, and concluded that no one was coming, that Earth had swallowed the finding the way a small power swallows what it is fed. Marsh read the surveillance log on the 10th morning and gave the authorization in writing, signed, timed, the way he had promised. He noted in the ledger that the subject dove alone, that the site was beyond the swim lanes, that no other person would be within 500 meters. Then he sat in the rented room above Correva Sound and looked at his own signature for a long time, because the last authorization he had signed 9 years ago had also looked like arithmetic, and he could still recite its costs. Wren opened the submersible's ballast logic overnight the way other men open a letter. Pharaoh and Iskra tracked the dive from the maintenance launch, holding station beyond sensor range. At a depth of 60 meters on the reef shelf where the warm current met the cold, the submersible's ballast accepted a new instruction set, vented forward, and put its nose into the shelf wall at flank speed. The canopy held, which surprised no one, because Wren had not touched the canopy. The scrubbers were what failed. The cabin air cycled into a closed loop and stayed closed, and the craft sat intact and powered on the bottom of a foreign sea while its scrubber, chemistry, replaced 2 nights earlier with a formulation Dren himself had once published a safety paper about, quietly stopped scrubbing. It took 11 minutes. They had not designed it to take 11 minutes. The sea decided that, or something did. Pharaoh reported the figure flatly over the secure link, and then said nothing else for the rest of the recovery window. When the Correva search teams raised the submersible 2 days later, they found the engineer drowned in his own unbreathable air and sealed in a waterproof document sleeve taped inside the canopy where no current could have put it, a copy of the Bureau of Public Com's finding on the Harrogate incident, with one line underscored in gray ink. The design had never anticipated occupancy during a burn. The Concorde's news services reported a diving accident. The Office of Stillness, Iskra confirmed within the week, reported nothing at all, but its internal traffic out of Celis doubled for 9 days, and a courtesy consultancy on a resort moon quietly stopped paying a retainer to a dead man, and somewhere in the gray building above the records crypt, somebody understood exactly what had been left taped inside that canopy and decided not to write it down. Folio 9 closed, actual expenditure, 5,210 marks, receipts attached, variance noted and explained to Quill's satisfaction. In the other column, the one without prices, Marsh entered 3 lines. Pharaoh's silence on the link, the 11 minutes, and the discovery, which he turned over in his hands for a week like a coin he could not spend, that the closing of the folio had felt like nothing at all, not triumph, not grief, not even the old cold satisfaction of craft. A page had turned. A man who had burned 6,000 people for being noisy had drowned in quiet, and the universe had registered no change in pressure, and Marsh had slept that night neither better nor worse than the night before. He was still turning that coin when Thiel knocked on his door with the first complication, 8 days later, her tablet showing the office's public registry of appointments. They filled his desk, she said. Engineering Directorate, Atmospheric Section. A promotion from the college, 29 years old, first posting. She set the tablet down in front of him, 9 seals on the instruction, Gideon. But the instruction came out of a building. The building is still issuing instructions. I know what the building is doing, Marsh said. Do you? Because I ran the numbers on the office's structure last night instead of sleeping. 9 seals. Behind them, a directorate of 200. Behind that, a college graduating 40 a year, a doctrine older than our spaceflight, and a budget that doesn't appear in any Concorde ledger I can find. And I can find all of them. We can spend the next 2 years closing folios, and at the end of it the still will have 9 new officers, and we'll have a book of receipts. She stopped, hearing her own voice, and moderated it. I'm not saying don't. I watched the Harrogate footage same as you. I'm asking what the 9th folio buys. It buys the account, Marsh said. What the account buys is not our column, not yet. It was the answer the mandate required, and Thiel accepted it the way professionals accept doctrine they have decided not to fight today. But after she left, Marsh sat with the gray ledger open under the lamp and looked at the descending folio numbers waiting on their blank pages, 8, 7, 6, and admitted into the silence of the rented room the thing he had not written anywhere yet, that she had asked the only question that mattered, and that he had been asking it himself since Correva, and that 30 years ago, in his first life, he had run a campaign very like this one against the killers of 3 human envoys, and closed every folio, and the institution that sent those killers had filled every desk within a season, and was, as far as he knew, thriving still. He did not write that down. He wrote instead, Folio 8, Subject Vescolaran, Station Environment Chief, Valoa, Seal 8, the officer who turned the key. Then he packed the ledger in oilcloth, told Hadid to book the cell passage on 3 separate carriers, and went down the stairs into the smell of the harbor to begin the second operation of a campaign he already suspected could not end the way Earth wanted it to end, and resolved on the last step with his hand on the salt-pitted rail that he would run it perfectly anyway, because the dead of Harrogate had been promised an account, and because a man who keeps the books does not get to skip the pages that frighten him. Valoa from orbit was a beautiful world wearing a scar. The Freeport sprawled silver along the equatorial coast, and east of it, under the track of the descending shuttle, lay the Harrogate enclave, a ring of habitation arcology a kilometer across, dead black in the middle of the living city, its windows blind, its gates sealed with Concord proof tape that had faded in 2 years from official, orange to the color of old bone. The Concord had wanted to demolish it within a season of the finding. The Human Survivors Association, 1,100 off-shift dock workers, and travelers who had missed the festival, the entire remainder of a community of 7,000, had chained the demolition gear to its own barges, and the Port Authority, embarrassed before its trading partners, had let the ruin stand. So it stood, the largest tombstone in human history, visible from final approach, and every operative in Marsh's cell pressed to the viewport in silence as the shuttle went down past it, and Marsh made himself watch too, and entered the sight of it that night in the column without prices. Coleraine was harder than Dren, because Coleraine had not been promoted out and salted away. He was still in post, chief of environmental systems for the entire Freeport, decorated after the incident for his calm management of a tragedy, which was the office's idea of wit. He moved with a driver and a watcher, he varied his routes, and his apartment block on the Corniche of Lamps housed 2 other port officials and was swept monthly by Concord counterintelligence. The still had run its arithmetic differently for a man still inside the machine. 16 days of pattern, Marsh ordered. Nobody touches anything. We are tourists, auditors, and bores. The line items went into the ledger before a single operator moved. Leases, legends, 2 vehicles bought outright from a yard that asked no questions and was paid not to learn any. A fishing boat with a compressor shed, surveillance optics threaded into a renovation scaffold across the Corniche, and a standing daily draw for what Quill's category sheet called local environment costs, which meant coffee, parking, and the bribes too small to have names. Projected total for Folio 8, 11,000 marks. Marsh wrote the figure, and then, beneath it in the other column, we are now spending more to kill one of them than the office spent to kill 6,000 of us. He looked at the sentence for a moment, then drew a single line through it, not to erase it, but the way an accountant rules off an entry that has been carried to another page. Thought belonged to the campaign now. It would travel with the book. The 16 days of pattern produced a man of habits and one flaw. Colaraine's habits were defensive and good. The varied routes, the watcher, the swept apartment, the lunches taken at his desk behind Port Authority security. The flaw was the Garden of Accord, a terraced public arboretum on the headland above the port, where on the first morning of every 10-day, he walked alone among the imported trees of 40 worlds, while his driver waited at the lower gate and his watcher, who suffered from the pollen of at least 6 of those worlds, remained in the car. Teal found the why of it in the port's own personnel file, which Wren opened through a maintenance subnet that had not been patched since before burn. The walk was prescribed. Concord Occupational Medicine, mandatory decompression protocol for officials carrying what the file called sustained administrative strain. The office had decorated Coleraine for his calm, and the port's own doctors had been treating him for 2 years because the calm was a performance that was eating him alive. Hadid read that page twice and said, he dreams about it then. His doctors think so, Marsh said. Good, said Hadid, who had pulled 4 bodies out of a depressurized school module at Ceres in her 20s and had never once in the years since pretended to be a softer woman than the work had made her. Then she went back to packing the medical kit, and Marsh entered her 1 syllable in the other column because it was a cost, even if he could not yet say whose. They took Coleraine on the first morning of the next 10-day, in the cedar terrace of the Garden of Accord, between a stand of earth, cedars the enclave's founders had donated to the city 60 years before, and a wall of flowering whitereed from the Seren homeworld. Farrow and Wren walked as botanists. Iskra held the approaches and ran a denial bubble that turned the terrace's 3 cameras into a slow loop of empty morning. Marsh had vetoed anything that could miss or spread. No charges, no long gun across a public garden. It would be close, quiet, and certain, and because it was close, it carried the one cost the long gun never billed. Coleraine saw them come and understood and had 4 seconds to speak. He did not beg, which Marsh had half expected and entirely dreaded. He looked at the 2 human men between the cedars and at the folded gray document Farrow drew from inside his jacket, and his shoulders went down by a centimeter, like a man setting down a case he had carried too far, and he said, in good trade, I requested reassignment twice. Then it doesn't help. Tell them that whoever sent you, it doesn't help. Afterward, Farrow reported the words exactly, because the mandate required everything written down, and Marsh wrote them, and they sat in the gray ledger under Folio 8 like a splinter under a nail. The search teams found the station chief at midday among the cedars, the finding of the Bureau of Public Comm folded on his chest with 1 line underscored, The seals on the habitation ring had engaged as designed. The Valoa Port Authority declared a security emergency. The Concorde's news services said nothing at all for 2 days, and then said heart failure, and 1,100 survivors of Harrogate stood along the chained fence of their dead district that evening in a silence that Iskra's intercepts said frightened the port governor more than any riot in the city's history would have. Folio 8, closed. Actual expenditure. 13,400 marks, the variance mostly the boat they scuttled and rowed off. In the other column, Marsh entered Collaren's 4 seconds, and the sentence "it doesn't help," and the fact, which he made himself record because the mandate said everything, that the man who turned the key on 6,000 people had spent 2 years dreaming about it, and that this had changed nothing about the necessity of the folio, and that he, Marsh, was beginning to understand that necessity and absolution were different currencies, and that nobody in this campaign would be paid in the second one. The Office of Stillness answered Folio 8 inside of 20 days, and it answered the way an institution answers. Not with grief, but with procedure. Iskra's collection, threaded through 3 relay species commercial traffic, watched the answer assemble. A counterintelligence directorate stood up a dedicated cell. Travel records for every human who had entered Concorde space in 2 years went under review, and a name began appearing in the routing codes of the new cell's traffic. An officer pulled back from the Concorde's eastern marches and given authority that cut across directorates. Inquirer Olshan Krev. Pole assembled the picture from registry scraps and old diplomatic gossip. Krev was Saren, 61 years in service, a counter-espionage officer of the old college, the one who had rolled up the Aldevar penetration of the Concorde treasury, the one who had caught the office's own deputy provost selling doctrine to a client species and walked him to the tribunal personally. Not a killer by trade. A man who read paper, who believed paper, who had reportedly once said that every operation in history was eventually betrayed by its own receipts. "He's us," Pole said. "He's you, Gideon, with different bones." "Then he knows the first thing I'd want him to forget," Marsh said, "that we have a paymaster. Money walks in front of every operation like a herald. From today, the cell banks nothing inside Concorde space for longer than a day, and Saskia rebuilds the laundering chain. Assume every transaction over 500 marks is being read." "That costs," Thiel said. "Write it down," said Marsh. The new cost went into Folio 7's projection, and Folio 7 was money anyway. Maru Ethek, Comptroller, Seal 7, the officer who had moved the unbudgeted funds that paid for the burn, the contractors, the replacement scrubber chemistry, the festival night duty roster that put the right officers on the right doors. Zethek had retired from the office's books 8 months after the incident and surfaced as a director of the Valoa Mutual Bond Society, which Thiel, following the filaments, identified within a week as one of the office's oldest financial limbs. A respectable mutual that held the pensions of half the Port Authority and 3 shells down, the operating float of the Still's external operations. "We could just kill him," Farrow said at the planning table, "without appetite, the way a carpenter says we could just paint over it." "We could," Marsh said. "And the float survives him, and the pensions survive him, and the office promotes another comptroller, and Saskia tells me the float is 400 million marks." He laid out the folio. "Seal 7 dies poor. The money is an organ. We cut it out and we show the Concorde what it was attached to. It took Thiel 51 days, the longest folio of the campaign to that point, and it cost more than the first 2 together. 38,000 marks in shell companies, bonded audits, and the purchase of a small failing reinsurance house on a neutral exchange whose only asset of value was its license to demand collateral, verification from counterparties. With that license, and with 11 years of the Bond Society's filings that Wren lifted out of a regulator's archive that believed itself unconnected to anything, Thiel built the document that the campaign would later be known by in 3 different intelligence services, a collateral demand, perfectly lawful, perfectly routine, that the Valoa Mutual Bond Society could not answer without revealing that 400 million marks of its reserves did not exist anywhere an auditor could stand. The run on the Bond Society began on a market morning in the port's 3rd quarter and was over by the noon gongs. The pensions were rescued by the Port Authority within a 10-day at the cost of a public subvention that required a public accounting, which was the point. The float was not rescued because no one who knew what the float was could afford to say so aloud. And Maru Ethek, Seal 7 of Instruction Veil 9, was arrested on the steps of his own mutual by Concord Financial Police for the crime the office could neither explain nor allow an explain, and his office pension, Iskra confirmed it from the routing traffic, and Marsh made him confirm it twice, was formally voided that same week by a personnel instruction sealed in the gray building above the records, crypt. The Still cut him loose to drown, in the firm institutional confidence that he would do it quietly. He did not drown quietly. On the fourth day of his detention, Maru Ethek told a Concord financial magistrate that he wished to make a statement concerning the source of the missing reserves, and on the fifth day, before the statement could be taken, he was found dead in a monitored cell of what the Bureau of Public Comm, the same bureau, the same gray prose, ruled to be heart failure. The cell heard it from Iskra at the evening meal, and nobody spoke for a while, and then Wren said slowly, "We didn't do that." "No," Marsh said. "They did. That's the second of their own they've subtracted because of us. Ethek today, and they'd have done Kohler themselves within the year, the state he was in." He looked around the table, at his people, at the gray ledger lying closed by the bread. "Understand what you're watching. The office isn't defending its officers, it's defending its arithmetic. Every seal we account for, they rerun the numbers on everyone who's left. We are not just hunting 9 names. We are teaching an institution to eat itself, and it is learning." He entered Folio 7 as closed, subject accounted for by the enemy's hand, expenditure 39,200 marks, receipts attached, and then he sat alone with the other column for a long time, because the entry it wanted was the one he had been refusing since Kareva. He wrote it at last in the small slanted hand by the light of the one lamp. "We have killed 2 men and bankrupted a third, and his own people murdered him in a cell, and the dead of Harrogate are exactly as dead as they were. And I no longer remember the feeling I am supposed to be working toward. I remember the feeling of the work. That is all that comes when I open this book, the work asking for its next page." He read it once, ruled it off, carried it forward. The first dispatch from Earth arrived that same week, by courier pouch through 3 cutouts, and it was 2 lines long. Plumb line keel count past 900. The frontier yards have stopped pretending. It was signed not by Halloran but by the Council's War Secretariat, and Marsh understood it was meant as encouragement. The sound of the other Earth, the daylight Earth, building its long answer behind him, and he read it to the cell because they were owed the knowledge that they were not alone in the dark with the arithmetic. Farrow listened with his arms folded and then said the thing Marsh had decided not to say. 2,200 hulls, Farrow said. "For that fleet to matter, our book has to be finished and published. And for our book to be published, every folio has to hold up in front of a tribunal and 100 billion strangers. We're not just killing them, are we? We're building the affidavit." "Yes," Marsh said. "Then Folio 6 has a problem," Farrow said, "because Folio 6 is the liar, and he lives in front of cameras." Cyric Vol. Seal 6. The Bureau of Public Comm's senior narrative officer, the author of The Finding, the man who had taken 6,212 dead human beings, and turned them into a maintenance recommendation in 4 paragraphs of perfect gray prose. He had been promoted since publicly. He gave lectures now at the Concord's Administrative College on what his own course, catalog called The Hygiene of Public Information. He lived in Celis itself, the capital, in the shadow of the Gray Building, inside the densest surveillance environment in Concord space, and he was, in the estimation of every analyst who had ever profiled the office, the vainest officer it had produced in a century. "His vanity is the approach," Pohl said, "building the legend on the table like a dealer laying cards. He's writing a book. A private college in neutral space invites him to deliver a named lecture series. We own the college by then. It costs about 6,000 marks a year to own a college, which I find personally offensive. He travels with 1 aide and 1 watcher because modesty photographs badly." And then, Marsh said, "We are not assassinating a lecturer on a stage in neutral space." "No," Pohl said. "We let him lecture. We record everything. And in his 3rd lecture on a stage he chose, in front of the cameras he insisted on, we arrange for him to be asked a single question by an accredited member of the audience, and we make sure he has, sitting in his own travel case back at the residence, the document that makes the question unanswerable. Then we publish the document an hour after he answers it falsely, in public on the record in his own voice." She looked up. "The folio doesn't kill him, Gideon. The folio makes him the first seal to be accounted for in daylight. The tribunal will want one of them alive and ruined and contradicted by his own mouth. Give them the liar." Marsh looked at the plan for a long time, and at the woman who had built it, and felt, for the first time since the Chandler's shop in Vigo, something move in the hollow place where the feeling was supposed to be. Not satisfaction, direction. The campaign bending 1 degree away from the grave and toward the courtroom. "Costed by Thursday," he said. "Folio 6 is approved in principle, and Lena, the audience member who asks the question, not one of ours." "I know," Pohl said. "I have someone better. There's a Survivors Association on Villoa with 1,100 members, and their elected recorder has been petitioning the Concord for the incident work logs for 2 years in correct legal form and being refused in correct legal form. Her name is Edith Moore. She was a docking supervisor. She missed the festival because she was on shift." Pohl paused. "I haven't approached her. I wanted you to decide because once we touch her, she's in our book too, and if this goes wrong, she pays for it. Write that down first, Marsh said quietly. Then bring me everything about her. I'll decide what we have no right to ask, and then I expect I'll ask it anyway. He met Edith Marr himself against every rule of his first life in the back room of the Survivors Association Hall on Valoa, with the chained fence of the dead enclave visible through the window over her shoulder. She was 50, broad-handed, with the flat, unhurried voice of a person who had run a docking floor for 20 years and had no fear left to spend on conversation. He told her less than the truth and more than was safe, that he represented people pursuing the Harrow Gate account by means the Concord would not approve of, that he could put a document in her hands that her 2 years of petitions had been refused, and that if she stood up in a public hall and used it, she would be marked by the Office of Stillness for whatever remained of her life. Moore listened without moving. Then she said, on the night of first rain, I signed the out roster for the third dock shift, 41 names. Every one of those people is alive because the port needed a freighter turned around by morning. I've had 2 years of being told that's luck. She looked out the window at the black ring. You're asking if I'll trade the rest of my life for the work logs. I'd have traded it for less. Show me the document. The lecture series ran in the third month after Folio 7 at a private college on the neutral exchange world of Brand's Landing, under a named endowment Pole had invented and funded for less than the cost of the fishing boat they had scuttled off of Eloa. Cyril Vall accepted in 11 days. He gave 2 lectures on the hygiene of public information to polite audiences that the cell salted lightly and recorded thoroughly, and he was, even his enemies conceded, superb, fluent, warm, modestly self-deprecating, a man who had made the management of truth sound like a branch of medicine. In the third lecture on the ethics of crisis communication, he took questions. Edith Moore stood up in the 4th row wearing the accreditation of a trade journal that had existed for 9 weeks and asked, in the flat, unhurried voice of the docking floor, whether the distinguished lecturer could explain why the environmental work logs for the Harrow Gate plant. She held up the petition reference, showed a full diagnostic of the burn system completed 6 weeks before the incident, signed off as fault-free by inspectors whose names matched the duty roster Vall's own finding had described as unavailable for review. It was a question only the author of the finding could recognize the size of, and the cameras he had insisted on watched him recognize it. He answered it the only way available to a man on a stage, smoothly, falsely, with regret for a grieving woman's confusion between document classes, and 70 minutes later, while his aide was still pouring drinks in the residence, the work logs, the fault-free diagnostic, the duty roster, and Instruction Veil 9 itself with its 9 gray seals went out together on the open nets of Brand's Landing, the Concord, Earth, and 40 client species over the accreditation codes of a trade journal that had existed for 9 weeks in a single document package titled in plain trade, the finding corrected. Vall was on a Concord liner by morning, recalled, and the gray prose machine he had built spent 3 frantic days calling the package a fabrication and then stopped mid-cycle because the office had discovered what Marsh's cell had known for a month. The diagnostic and the roster were verifiably real, sealed with Concord registry chains no forger could counterfeit, and every species in the trading sphere had registrars capable of confirming it, and several pointedly did. The Concord's foreign ministry issued a statement promising review. 3 client species recalled ambassadors for consultations. On Valoa, the Port Authority voted to place a memorial light on the chained fence of Harrow Gate, over the objection of its own governor, and the Bureau of Public Comm's senior narrative officer was quietly removed from the Administrative College's catalog. His named lectureship dissolved, his book contract lapsed, his face, the one asset he had spent a career compounding, suddenly the most recognizable evidence exhibit in known space. Folio 6 closed and not a drop of blood in it. Actual expenditure, 61,000 marks, the named endowment written off in full. Marsh entered the close with something that a younger man might have permitted himself to call hope, and the campaign learned within 9 days what hope cost, because the office ran its arithmetic on the leak, and the arithmetic settled wrongly on a junior records archivist in the Bureau of Public Comm named Senna Ills, a Sarin woman of 26 who had, the cell knew from Iskra's collection, never touched the package and never met a human in her life. And the morning she was to be transferred to the office's internal examination, she went off the roof of the records annex, and the Bureau wrote heart failure on a woman who had fallen 9 floors, because the gray prose machine had restarted and that was the only sentence it knew. Iskra brought the intercept to Marsh at night, and stood there while he read it and said, "We did that. The office did that. The office pulled the trigger we loaded," Iskra said. His voice was level and terrible. "I've run signals for you for 11 years, Gideon. I'll run them till this is finished. But I want her in the book. Not in the secret column. I know about the secret column, we all do. In the folio. In the part that gets published. If the mandate is the truth with our names on it, then her name goes in, and the tribunal and 100 billion strangers can read what our cleanest operation cost a records clerk who never hurt anyone. Yes, Marsh said. She goes in the folio. And after Iskra had gone, he opened the gray book and wrote Senna Ills into the permanent record of folio 6, cause and consequence, and then sat with his hands flat on the page and understood that he had stopped being able to tell whether the campaign was an account being settled or a fire that had learned bookkeeping. The work asked for its next page. He turned it. Folio 5. Antavesh, Registrar, Seal 5. The cutout. The officer whose seal sat exactly in the middle of the instruction, who had carried Veil 9 between the planners and the executors, registered its funds, and notarized its lies into the Concord's own archival chain. On paper, he was the most guilty signature of the 9. Every other seal touched a piece of the crime, and Tavesh had touched all of it. For 5 weeks, the cell built the folio toward a removal, and for 5 weeks, the folio refused to close, because everything Thiel and Pohl turned up said the same wrong thing. Tavesh had no hush retainer. Tavesh had no promotion. Tavesh lived in a registrar's flat in Celis on a registrar's salary, kept no security, and went nowhere except the records crypt, the flat, and once every 10 days, a long-term medical residence in the Lake District where, Wren finally opened the residence's billing, the Office of Stillness was paying, through 4 shells, for the care of Tavesh's 2 brood siblings, both invalided, both listed under altered names, both registered, in a final gray flourish as wards of the very registrar's office Tavish ran. It's not payment, Pohl said. Look at the dates. The wardship was created 11 days before Veil 9 was sealed. They didn't buy him. They took his family into custody and called it charity, and then they put the instrument on his desk. He still sealed it, Pharaoh said. He sealed it with a gun in his family's mouth, Hadid said. So did Kolarin, in his way. So did half of every atrocity in history. Pharaoh looked at Marsh. Where's the line, Gideon? I'd like to know which coercions we forgive before I'm told to kill the next one. The line is what he does when the gun moves, Marsh said slowly, and the folio turned over in his mind like the submersible on the shelf and settled into a different shape. The office's hold on him is the residence. The residence is in the Lake District, outside the security envelope of the capital, because the still never imagined anyone could find it. We move the family first. Then we put our offer on the registrar's desk the way the office put theirs. Complete. And we find out what Antavesh seals when he's free to choose. It cost 90,000 marks, a chartered medical transport, a forged inter-district transfer order that was Pohl's masterwork and that she said afterwards she never wanted to equal, and the most dangerous 11 hours of the campaign to that point, and at the end of it, Tavesh's brood siblings were aboard a ship registered to a humanitarian trust 4 jurisdictions deep, and on Tavesh, Seal 5 of Instruction Veil 9, sat across a table from Gideon Marsh in a grain broker's office in the Celis Lowtown with the proof of their safety in his hands, shaking, and said, I have waited 2 years for someone to come. I thought it would be my own service to tidy me away. I kept things. Tell me you're the people who can use what I kept. What Tavesh had kept, registered into hidden cells of the archival chain by the one officer in the Concord who knew the chain well enough to hide things in it, was the skeleton of the Office of Stillness itself, the unbudgeted float's true books, the wardship instruments for 19 other coerced officials, the burn contractor's indemnities, and the crown of it, the thing that reset the campaign's entire arithmetic, the existence and location of the Still Repository, the office's master archive, 3 centuries of executive instructions with their seals, every subtraction the institution had ever performed on 40 species, kept in a crypt beneath the gray building, and consolidated once a year during a closed accounting ritual, the office called the Audit of Silence. Every instruction since the founding, Tavesh said. Veil 9 is 1 page of it. There are thousands. The Concord's own council has never seen inside. Half of them are in it. You came to collect 9 seals. He pushed the index across the table with 2 hands formally, like a man making a deposition. The 9 seals are the receipt human. That crypt is the crime. Marsh sent the index to Earth that night under triple cipher with his own assessment appended, and the assessment said what he had not dared write since Teal had asked her question over the appointments registry, that 9 removals would amputate fingers and leave the hand, that the campaign as mandated would end with the account collected and the arithmetic intact, and that for the first time there existed a target whose removal would be final, not the officers but the institution, not the men but the memory and the method and the doctrine, the entire engine, documented in its own hand across 300 years, in one place, once a year. He proposed to take the Still Repository whole and publish it, all of it. every species the office had ever subtracted from, reading the instructions with the seals attached. He costed it honestly. It would take months, it would take the remaining folios as stepping stones, it would likely take lives from his own table. And if it failed, Earth's affidavit and Earth's deniability would die together in a crypt under Celis. Halloran's reply took 9 days, which meant the council had fought over it, and when it came it was 1 line longer than the dispatches usually ran. Mandate amended. Folio 1 is redefined, the office entire by its own records. Plumline keel count 1400. Build your affidavit. Earth is building the consequence. The second line was in Halloran's own hand, not the Secretariat's. You ask me in Vigo what the 9th folio buys. Buy this and I will be able to answer you. The Office of Stillness moved first. It had been hunting them since Kariva. Patiently, correctly, the appointments registry teaching it nothing, and the money walking on Thiel's new, chain teaching it less. But Inquirer Ulshan Krev had spent those months doing what the profile said he did, reading paper. He could not find the cell, so he read what the cell had touched. He read the 9-week trade journal backward to its registration agent. He read the named endowment backward to a stationer's district in Vigo. And he read the Survivors Association of Harrogate forward because Edith Marr had stood up in the 4th row of a lecture hall with documents no petitioner had ever been granted. And Krev, alone in the office, seemed to have concluded that the woman was not a fabricator but a thread. The office's older instincts concluded otherwise. 11 weeks after the finding was corrected, while Marsh's cell was deep in the architecture of the amended Folio 1, a cargo drone crossed the Valoa port exclusion line on a falsified maintenance code and detonated against the Survivors Association Hall during the weekly claims session where the Terran Claims Commission's civilian annex processed compensation filings for the families of the dead. 14 people were killed, 9 human claimants, 4 association volunteers, and the commission's junior actuary, a 28-year-old from Lagos named Benedict Osei, whom Marsh had met twice and Quill had trained personally. Edith Moore, who ran the sessions, survived because she had stepped out to the fence to escort an elderly claimant to a tram and came back through the smoke to organize the stretchers with the flat, unhurried voice of the docking floor. The Concorde's news services reported a fueling accident for 6 hours. Then they stopped because the Valoa Port registrars, Tavesh's own guild, and not consulted, published the drone's falsified maintenance code with its registry chain attached, and the chain ran upward through 4 shells into the gray building, and this time there was no archivist to throw off a roof big enough to bury it. The Office of Stillness had, for the first time in 300 years, been caught operating in daylight against civilians, against claimants, on the site of its own previous massacre. Marsh stood that night in the burned shell of the Association Hall, against every rule again, and past caring, and watched Hadid work the triage line, and watched Edith Moore write the 14 names on the wall in dock chalk because the claims ledgers had burned, and he felt the hollow place where the feeling should have been fill at last. And what filled it was not grief and not wrath, but something colder and older and almost restful. Certainty. The arithmetic had shown itself. There was nothing to doubt anymore. An institution that answered bookkeeping with bombs had no reform in it, no deterrence threshold, no settlement price. It would subtract and subtract until it was made structurally unable to subtract, and Earth, he understood Halloran's whole design now, the fleet and the affidavit, the daylight and the dark, the long answer assembling on 2 fronts. Earth was the only power in the sphere that had decided to make it so, and had been deciding it, coldly and in writing since a room above a chandler's shop in Vigo. He opened the gray ledger on a fire-stained table in front of witnesses, because the secret column was over, and wrote where the cell and Edith Moore and the smoke could see, 14 names, added to 6,212. The account is no longer 9 seals. The account is the Office of Stillness, entire principal and interest, and the currency of settlement is its existence. Then he ruled the line, dated it, and turned the page, and the page that came up was Folio 4, and for the first time in 30 years of ledgers the work did not have to ask. But the page had to wait, because Inquirer Krev had been reading paper for 7 months, and in the week after the Association Hall burned, the paper finally answered him. The vehicle yard outside the Valoa port, the one that asked no questions and was paid not to learn any, was raided at dawn by office field teams. Its owner taken east on a closed warrant, and the owner, who knew nothing about the cell except a face, a payment chain, and a berth number 2 shells deep, gave up all 3 inside a day because the office's examination doctrine had not been written by gentlemen. The berth was empty. Marsh had rotated the cell's Valoa footing after the bombing on instinct older than any procedure. But the payment chain was Thiel's second-generation laundering route, and the face belonged to Wren, And within 60 hours, the Concorde's border registries were carrying a composite of a human marine systems contractor with a habit of renting compressor sheds, and the campaign's entire support architecture in Concord space was, in the language of Marsh's first life, on fire from the floor. They lost the fishing routes, the grain broker's office in the low town, 2 stage caches, and a courier line that had taken Pole 5 months to build. They lost their banker on Brand's Landing, who was not arrested, but who looked at the border traffic and resigned by the simple expedient of ceasing to exist, taking with him nothing of the cells but his nerve, and leaving Thiel to rebuild the financial spine of the campaign a third time, in 19 days, on no sleep through neutral exchanges that now demanded a premium for human-adjacent risk. The line items of that month had no operation attached to them at all. Marsh ruled them as a folio without a number, titled in his slanted hand attrition, survival, overhead of being hunted 91,000 marks. And Quill receded every entry without comment, and then, at the end of the month, added 1 line in his own gray script, the only entry the paymaster ever volunteered. Cost of the adversary finally respecting us, not billable, long overdue. The worst of it was not the money. The worst of it reached Vigo by courier pouch in the middle of the rebuilding, an intercept, flagged by Iskra at the highest grade, of Inquirer Krev addressing a closed session of the Concord High Council's Security Committee. He did not speculate. He laid out with a registrar's economy the pattern of 8 months: Kareva, the Garden of Accord, the Bond Society, Brand's Landing, the Lake District, the falsified treasury hold, and he named it, for the council's record, a foreign retribution campaign of state character, methodical, solvent, documented, and patient. And he told the committee the one thing the office had never told it in 300 years, which was that the instrument could not guarantee a result. 3 council members demanded the matter be raised with Earth through open channels. The motion failed by 2 votes, but it reached Earth anyway within the 10-day, through the ordinary seepage of frightened institutions, and Marsh received a dispatch from the War Secretariat that was the closest the daylight campaign ever came to blinking. Exposure assessed as material. Council majority holding but soft. Advise whether campaign can conclude on accelerated timeline, or whether suspension is preferable to discovery. He sat with that dispatch through one entire turning of the harbor tide, because 30 years of discipline said there was a version of this where the right answer was suspension, fold the cell, bank the 6 closed folios, let plumb line and the published finding carry the weight, and accept that seals 4 through 1 would die of old age in fortified comfort while the office relearned its balance. It would be called prudence. Halloran's successors would call it that in the histories, and the dead of Harrogate, who had been promised an account and not an installment, would have been answered the way the galaxy had always answered them. Substantially, reasonably, almost. He drafted his reply 4 times and sent the shortest version, and it said, "The account does not close at 6 of 9. Accelerated timeline accepted. Request plumb line gunnery trials be conducted this season, publicly on the frontier ranges, with registry observers invited." And when Thiel asked him what the fleet's gunnery had to do with their timeline, he said, "Krev told their council the truth, so we will tell it too. The office reads our folios, the council reads the fleet. Let them spend the season watching 2,200 hulls rehearse, and every soft vote on that committee will understand that discovering us is worse than enduring us. Fear of the daylight buys room for the dark. It worked the way honest threats work, slowly and completely." The open channels motion was never raised again. The frontier registry spent the season filing range reports, and the campaign bought back, at the price of 1 season's acceleration and 91,000 marks of overhead, the thing no operation survives losing. Time on its own terms. Folio 4. Breth Callan, Field Director, Seal 4. The officer who had commanded the burn on the ground. Line items entered before departure, and Marsh made the cell watch him enter them, because the numbers had become a language and he wanted them fluent in it. Transit and legends for 6 operators across 3 jurisdictions, 11,000 marks. 2 vehicles, a coastal property lease on the fortified shore of Dremel's world, weapons and counter-surveillance equipment, staged through 4 customs regimes, 22,000. Standing bribery environment, 4,000. Medical reserve doubled at Haddad's written insistence, 6,000. Projected total, 43,000 marks, and beneath it, in the column that now belonged to everyone, Marsh wrote, "Callan is the first SEAL who will see us coming, because Krev will be standing behind him. Expect to pay in the other currency." Callan was no registrar and no lecturer. He had spent 30 years in the office's operations directorate. He had run subtractions on 6 worlds before Harrogate, and after the Association Hall bombing, which Iskra's collection said Callan had opposed, not on principle but on tradecraft, He had been pulled back to the fortified coast of Dremel's world and wrapped in a protection detail of 9, with overlapping sensor fields, a hardened residence, and a standing air picket. The office had finally understood what it was in and had put its best surviving operational mind inside a fortress and given the fortress to Inquirer Krev. Krev had also, Iskra established over 3 patient weeks, done something subtler. The fortress had a flaw, and the flaw was deliberate, and the flaw was a lure. Kalan's medical resupply, he had a degenerative condition of the inner shell, common in Sarin males of his age, arrived by the same bonded courier route on the same day of every 10 day, and the route's security was, by the standard of everything else around him, lazy. It was the kind of gap a hunting cell finds in week 1 and trusts in week 6. It was bait, and it was good bait, and Marsh looked at it on the planning table for a long time, and then looked at the date of the next audit of silence, 11 months out, and at his people, who were tired in the particular way that doesn't show until it costs, and made the decision he would write into the folio in advance, initialed, so the tribunal would someday know exactly what had been chosen with open eyes. "We take the bait," he said, "because Krev expects us to find it, refuse it, and look for the real gap. That's what he'd do and what I'd do, and he knows it. So there is no real gap. The rest of that fortress will be honest. The courier route is the only door, and it's a door with a gun behind it. We go through it anyway on a day he can't fully staff it, and we make the day ourselves." He turned to Thiel. "The picket and the detail are billed through the Dremel Garrison Authority. Garrison authorities get audited. Build me a payroll crisis." It took Thiel 9 days to forge a Concord Central Treasury hold order against the Dremel Garrison's contractor accounts, Tavesh's registry knowledge turning the instrument from plausible to perfect, and on the morning the hold landed, half of Callan's contracted outer detail was declared out of bond and confined to barracks pending verification, and the bonded courier service, suddenly unpaid, accepted without comment the substitute crew that Pohl's paperwork said had been subcontracted for the route. The substitution would survive scrutiny for perhaps 5 hours. The operation needed 2. It got 1. Krev had built a second trap inside the first, and it was not in the route or the residence or the sensor fields. It was in the courier manifest itself, a checksum ritual between courier and gatehouse that appeared in no procedure Wren had lifted. Because it had never been written down, it lived in the heads of the gatehouse staff, 10 day after 10 day, a spoken passphrase pair, archaic, ridiculous, unbeatable. The kind of thing a man who believed in paper would build precisely because he knew his enemy could read all of it. The substitute crew's challenge answer was wrong in the first 30 seconds at the outer gate, and the fortress went loud. Pharaoh held the gatehouse lane for 2 minutes and 40 seconds against a reacting detail of 4, so that Wren, already inside the resupply bay with the manifest cart, could reach the inner door at all. The folio's clean plan died at the gate. What replaced it was the other thing, the thing nobody writes a job title for, executed at close quarters by professionals on both sides in a confined architecture that favored neither. Wren took the inner door and the residence corridor and found Reth Callan exactly where the fire plan said the principal would be held, in the hardened study, behind 2 guards, and the office's field director, who had commanded the burn from a Port Authority annex with a stopwatch. The logs would later show, calling the 11 minutes out loud for the duty record, looked at the human coming through his last door with a breaching shield and a service pistol, and reached not for the alarm but for the desk drawer, and Wren put 2 rounds through the drawer and 1 through the man. And the drawer was afterward found to contain not a weapon but a sealed courier pouch, addressed to the Concord High Council, containing what analysts on 3 worlds would spend a year arguing was either Callan's insurance or Callan's confession. They brought Pharaoh out through the breached gate with the detail converging, and he was alive at the vehicles and alive at the coast, and he died on the water, on the gray sea of a world none of them had ever wanted to see, with Hadid's hands inside the wreck of his chest and Marsh holding the line open, because Pharaoh had asked, in the last clear minute, whether the folio had closed. Marsh said yes, it was even true. Pharaoh said, "Write the variance," which was a joke, the only one he had made in 2 campaigns, and then he stopped being anything but a name with 60 pages of receipts behind it. Wren lost the lower half of his left hand at the gatehouse and finished the exfiltration without mentioning it, which Hadid said afterward was not stoicism but blood loss. The cell crossed 3 jurisdictions home in 14 hours of silence. Folio for 4, closed, actual expenditure, 51,000 marks. Variance, 1 operator, Dario Ferro, killed in action, 1 operator maimed, itemized, receipted, carried forward in a currency that did not convert. Marsh wrote the folio in full that night, every minute of it, the failed checksum, the gun behind the door, his own decision to take a baited route with open eyes, and he attributed the trap to Krev by name because the record was the mandate and the record would someday be read by 100 billion strangers, and one of them was going to be Krev, and Marsh wanted him to find the page where the human handler wrote, "The trap was correct, the entry was correct, and a man is dead because two professionals were both right at the same gate. There is no variance column wide enough for what this work actually costs. I have stopped pretending the book balances. I keep it because the alternative to a book that doesn't balance is a fire that doesn't count." Quill, presenting the folio's accounts, stopped at the variance line and for the only time in the campaign set down his pen. "I trained Osei," he said. "Now, Pharaoh, I'd like the record to show the paymaster understood what the money was for." It was not a question, and Marsh did not treat it as one. He added the line. The book had become the kind of thing everyone wanted to be inside. The office answered Folio 4 with silence, real silence this time, not the procedural kind. No replacement was posted to the operations directorate. The protection details around the remaining seals were not reinforced. Two were, Iskra's collection showed, quietly reduced. For 9 days the cell read the traffic and could not find the institution's pulse. And then Thiel found it, where she always found everything, in the money. The office's unbudgeted float, rebuilt painfully since the Bond Society's collapse, was moving, not to operations, to archives. Conservation contractors, vault engineering, data perpetuity trusts on 4 neutral worlds. The Still was spending like an institution that had stopped planning to win and started planning to be remembered. And in the middle of the movement, one anomaly with a name on it, the Office of Deputy First Clerk, Imra Sen, Seal 3, had requested from the registry crypt a complete certified copy of Instruction Veil 9. Original, with the seal impressions imaged in depth, and the request had been refused by an authority that outranked her, of whom there was exactly one. "Cyril is sealing the tomb," Pohl said, "and his own deputy is outside it asking for a copy of the murder weapon. That's not loyalty. That's a woman assembling a defense." Imra Sen contacted them 11 days later, not the cell, whose existence the office still could not prove, but Earth openly, through the Terran Claims Commission's legal counsel on Veloa, in a filing so brazen that Halloran's dispatch relaying it carried, for the first time in the campaign, something resembling humor. Deputy First Clerk of the Office of Stillness petitions the Commission for recognized witness status in the matter of the Harrogate incident, offers testimony and documentary evidence concerning Instruction Veil 9, requests in exchange immunity, extraction, and security of person. She named her price in the petition's final clause, and the final clause was the institution's dying voice speaking through its second-ranking officer. In any subsequent settlement, the continuity of the Office of Stillness as a reformed instrumentality shall be preserved. They met her once, in a bonded arbitration suite on Brand's Landing, Marsh and a commission lawyer, whose presence made the meeting lawful and whose terror made it brief. Sen was old college, precise, unrepentant in the way of officers who have replaced conscience with jurisdiction. She laid out what she offered. The SEAL's command chronology, Sorel's personal authorship of Veil 9, her own dissent recorded, she said, in the proper channel, which Marsh by then knew enough to recognize as the office's deepest cynicism, a formal registry where officers could deposit objections that would never be read, the institutional equivalent of a prayer. And she offered the date and protocol of the next audit of silence, when the Still repository's vaults would be opened for consolidation and every instruction in 3 centuries would stand cataloged in one place for 11 days. In exchange, she said, the office survives. Renamed, purged, supervised, drafted your treaty language. I am not sentimental, but the instrument survives. You are a professional human. You understand that the Concord's stability has been maintained for 300 years by precisely calibrated subtraction, and that what replaces a dismantled service is always worse than what was dismantled, and that your own Earth will, within a generation, quietly construct the same instrument under a different name, because every polity does. I am offering you everything you came for. The price is that you leave the machine and take them in. Madam Deputy, Marsh said, I've spent 40 years in the rooms where that argument is made, and I've made it myself, and here is what I have learned. At a cost I am no longer able to estimate. The men are not the machine's operators. The men are its product. Every officer who pressed a seal into Veil 9 was manufactured by the machine you're asking me to preserve, including, if I read your dissent registry correctly, the ones who objected first and sealed anyway. Earth is not collecting 9 men. Earth is recalling the product and closing the plant. He stood. Your testimony will be welcome at the tribunal, with or without immunity. The date of the audit we will take from you or take without you. And the Office of Stillness will not survive in any name, because the dead of Harrogate are owed a specific debt, and the debt is this, that it becomes structurally impossible for any clerk in that building ever to write the word quiet about a human settlement again. Sen studied him with the flat regard of her service, and what she said then went into the folio verbatim because it was the closest thing to a confession the old college would ever produce. Sorel said you would say that. He has said from the beginning that we mistook your species' bookkeeping for weakness. That a race that counts its dead one at a time would eventually arrive at our door with the ledger open. She gathered her case. The audit date will be in the filing. I will testify. Not for immunity, withdraw it. I find I don't care, but because I dissented into a channel I knew was a void, and that human is the only entry in your other column I am ashamed of. She walked out of the arbitration suite, declined the commission's protection, and was arrested at the Celis Orbital Interchange 9 days later by the Concord's own civil magistracy, not the office. The distinction mattered, and the whole sphere understood it. On charges flowing from the published registry chains, the first serving officer of the still ever to stand in an open Concord court. The office did not save her. The office did not kill her. The office, the traffic showed, no longer agreed with itself about which of those things it was for, and Folio 3 closed itself in daylight by the enemy's own fracturing hand at a cost to Earth of 2 transit legends and a lawyer's fee. Folio 2 never opened at all. Provost Andis Moore, Seal 2, master of the office's college, the man who had trained every other name on the instruction and written the doctrine of subtraction's modern catechism, was found dead in the college's own contemplation garden on the morning Sen's arrest reached the news services and the Bureau of Public Calm, in what Marsh understood to be the institution's first honest document in 3 centuries, declined to state a cause at all. The internal traffic was almost grieving. The still had begun subtracting forward, ahead of the ledger, removing its own past before the past could be deposed. Marsh entered the folio in 4 lines and felt the hollowing again as he did it, not because Moore was dead, but because the campaign had reached the state his oldest doubt had predicted. The machine was now doing their work for them, eating itself exactly as he had told the cell it was learning to, and there was no satisfaction in it anywhere, only the gray arithmetic. Running downhill. 8 seals accounted, 1 left, and below the last name, beneath the whole descending column, the true target, the building above the crypt, 11 days a year with its tomb door open. The parley he had been expecting for 2 years came the week before the audit, the way he had always known it would. A single sheet of paper, hand-delivered to a cutout in Vigo, who should not have been findable, unsigned, in the old diplomatic trade of the college. The Garden of Accord, Valoa, the Cedar Terrace, 1 10-day hence at the morning hour. Bring the book if you like, I have read everything else. And Marsh sat above the chandler's shop where the campaign had begun, holding the invitation from Inquirer Olshan Krev, and found that the only feeling left in the hollow place was a professional's strange, exhausted gratitude. That before the end, the one officer on the other side who had earned an accounting was asking for one, in the place where the cell had taught the office that no garden was safe, which meant the choice of ground was a message. And the message was, I am standing where you killed us, unguarded. Come and tell me why. The cell voted against the meeting unanimously, which was their right, and Marsh went anyway, which was his. He took no weapon, no wire, and no cover except a dead man's switch on the Gray Ledger's published release. If he failed to transmit a phrase by nightfall, every closed folio went onto the open nets a year ahead of schedule, and he walked up through the terraces of the Garden of Accord in the morning light with a book under his arm, past the white reed, into the stand of earth cedars, where a tall Sarin in a plain registrar's coat stood looking at the place between the trees as if it were an exhibit, which, in the only museum that mattered now, it was. Vescolaran requested reassignment twice, Krev said without turning. I processed the second request myself, years ago, in another posting. I refused it. The protocols were clear and he met none of the criteria, because the criteria were written by the office, for the office, to keep men at their desks. He turned. His eyes were the color of the proof tape on the enclave fence. You left our own finding on his body. I have spent 2 years deciding whether that was cruelty or instruction. It was filing, Marsh said. We returned a document to its authors. Yes, Krev said, that is what I concluded. He gestured, courteously, at the stone bench along the terrace, and they sat, 2 old men in a garden above a port, the way the trade had always conducted its truest business, in the open, in daylight, between professionals who had run out of moves worth hiding. I know your name now, Gideon Marsh. I had it 11 weeks after Dremel's World. From the way your folio there was constructed, you wrote it for me to read someday. That was either vanity or an invitation, and your career suggests you have never once been vain. So I am answering the invitation. Before the audit of silence, which you know the date of, because Sen sold it, and which my service believes it can defend, because my service has begun believing only what it needs to. And you? I believe what the paper says, Krev said simply. I have read the repository, human. All of it. Rank has its one privilege. 300 years of instructions, and I read them across one winter when I was being considered for first clerk, before Sorrel was chosen instead, and I will tell you what is actually in that crypt, since you have paid so much to open it. It is not a record of monsters. It is worse. It is a record of reasonable officers, winter after winter, choosing the smaller subtraction to avoid the larger war, and being correct by their own audit every single time, every time but once. We kept the peace of 40 species for 3 centuries at a price that was always paid by someone too small to bill us for it. And then 6,000 dock workers prospered too loudly, and the same reasonable instrument wrote Veil 9, and I read it the winter after the burn, and I went looking through 300 years for the page where we had become the thing the instrument was built to prevent. He looked at the cedars. There is no page. That is the finding, Marsh. There is no page where it turns. The first instruction and the last are written in the same hand, and the hand was always this. Marsh set the gray ledger on the bench between them and did not open it. Then you know why Earth won't take the machine and leave the men, or the men and leave the machine. You've read our terms by now. Since filing made them public. Dissolution. The repository published. The trial at Harrogate, on the ground, inside the fence. I know your terms. I came to negotiate one of my own. Krev's hands, like Marsh's, were folded still, the hands of men who had spent careers keeping them so. Cyril will burn the crypt. It is not built to be burned. Perpetuity was our one piety, but he has spent a year making it possible, and the contractor's invoices are hidden, where only a man who believes in paper would look, and I have looked. When your operation enters that vault, and you will get in, I have also read you, and the audit's defenses were designed by men who think you are still 9 seals and a grudge. Sorrel will not defend the archive. He will light it, and stand in front of the Concord and grieve its loss. And without the repository, your tribunal has Veil 9 and 8 dead or ruined officers, and the Office of Stillness becomes a martyrdom with a budget line. And in 30 years, it is rebuilt by reasonable officers who will have learned exactly one lesson: keep better fires. He turned his proof tape eyes on Marsh. I will not let 300 years of the dead be burned twice. My term is this. The archive survives entire, not curated, not redacted, mine and yours and everyone's shame in one piece. Guarantee me that, in writing, in that book, and on the night of the audit, the checksum at the crypt door will be answered correctly. You'd open the tomb yourself. I am the last officer of my college, Krev said. The college taught that the record is the institution's soul, and the institution sold its soul, and what remains is the record. Let the soul testify. He rose and straightened the plain coat, and for one moment the dryness cracked, and what was underneath was 300 years old and very tired. I have 1 species worth of standing to ask anything of you, Marsh, and I spend it now. When it is published, when 40 species are reading what was done to them in gray prose, your Earth will be holding the only copy that matters and the biggest fleet in the sphere. What you do in that hour decides whether the next 3 centuries get a better instrument or just a bigger one. Your race counts its dead one at a time. I am asking you to count ours the same way. Marsh opened the ledger, there on the bench, to the first blank page of Folio 1 and wrote the guarantee in his small slanted hand and signed it and dated it and let Krev read it. The inquirer studied the page the way he had studied everything, then pressed his personal seal, the seal of a serving officer of the Office of Stillness, the 10th seal of the campaign, into the margin beside a human signature, and walked out of the garden past the cedars without looking at the ground between them again. The audit of silence began on the first morning of the Concord's accounting season, when the gray building above the records crypt sealed its public floors, and the office's surviving registrars descended to perform the consolidation their institution had performed annually for 3 centuries. The defense of the crypt during the 11 open days was, as Krev had said, designed against 9 seals and a grudge. It assumed infiltration, assassination, theft of single instruments. It did not assume that the bonded data perpetuity contractors arriving to install Sorrel's quiet incendiary upgrades had been wholly owned by Saskia. Feel for 5 months that their equipment manifests had been rebuilt by Lena Pohl around freight-rated exfiltration cradles, that the crypt's atmosphere handling subcontract had passed through a Veloa Registrars Guild whose every member had stood at the chained fence, or that the checksum ritual at the tomb door, the unwritten one, the spoken one, the one that had cost Dario Ferro his life on Dremel's world, would be answered correctly in the old diplomatic trade of the college by the inquirer of the Office of Stillness standing at the door himself on the 4th night of the audit, as rank entitled him to do. What happened in the crypt on the 4th night was, by the standard of everything the campaign had paid to reach it, almost without drama, and Marsh ran it from a freight office across the square with the ledger open and the line items entered in advance. The largest folio of the war costed to the mark $290,000, Every receipt already filed because the operation was the receipts. Ren opened nothing. Every door was opened for them by paper. Iskra silenced nothing. The crypt's own consolidation protocols required its monitoring dark. For 6 hours, human stevedores and contractors Bond moved 3 centuries of the Concorde's secret history out through the atmosphere-handling shafts in perpetuity cradles rated for vacuum, fire, and time, while above them the gray building went on believing what its manifest told it, and Antavesh, registrar of registrars, stood at the indexing stations validating chain of custody on every cradle because the tribunal would require that the archive arrive not merely intact but provable, and the mandate had been the same since Vigo, documented. Receipted signed, Searle's fire found nothing. On the 6th night, when the substitution of weighted blanks for the deep stacks could no longer survive the consolidation count, the first clerk of the Office of Stillness was woken by his duty officer with the impossible inventory, and the building's logs, published later, like everything else, recorded that he stood in the emptied crypt for 11 minutes without speaking, and then issued his final instruction as first clerk. A general order to the office's remaining stations to destroy local records, which the stations, reading the inventory in the sky, almost uniformly declined. The instrument had stopped answering its hand. He ran on the 8th night, as Marsh had known he would, because the folio on Oven Sorel had been the thinnest of the 9 in everything except this. The man had never once, in 40 years, remained in a building where the arithmetic had turned. He ran for the one door the Concorde could not watch, a diplomatic packet boat bonded to the office's oldest client species, from a sealed bay in the Celis interchange, with the last loyal remnant of his protection detail and a courier case whose contents would be inventoried for the tribunal as 1 original of instruction veil 9 seals, 1 personal descent registry key, and the unfinished manuscript of a history of the Office of Stillness, authored by himself in gray prose. The packet boat cleared the interchange, made its escape burn, and rose out of Celis's shadow into the accounting season's pale morning, into a sky that was not empty. It had not been empty for 9 hours. Task Group Plumline had crossed the Concorde frontier the night the archive came out of the crypt. 2,200 human hulls in open formation, transponders lit, broadcasting on every registry channel in the sphere a single document package and a single sentence, and the package was the corrected finding with the full repository index attached, and the sentence in plain trade was, "Earth is closing an account. No vessel will be harmed that does not stand between us and the building." The fleet had not fired a shot. The fleet did not need to fire a shot. It hung across the morning sky of the Concorde's capital world like a ruled line at the bottom of a column, and the packet boat's pilot, a bonded professional with no seals on anything, looked at 2,200 hulls and at his passenger, and turned the boat around and surrendered the first clerk of the Office of Stillness at the Celis interchange to the only authority present willing to take custody, the civil magistracy of the Concorde, standing on its own law with the whole sphere watching. Folio 1 closed, 9 seals. 2 drowned in their own arithmetic, 1 bankrupted and subtracted by his own service, 1 ruined in daylight by his own voice, 1 freed and turned and standing now in a tribunal's witness registry, 1 killed through a desk drawer on a fortified coast, 1 awaiting open trial by her own dissent, 1 dead in a college garden ahead of the ledger, and the first seal, the author, taken alive at the interchange with the original instruction in his luggage. Beneath them, ruled off the true entry, the Office of Stillness, principal and interest. Actual expenditure of the campaign, every folio summed, with variances, 611,000 marks, 1 operator killed in action, 1 operator maimed, 1 records archivist, Senna Ills, dead of the office's arithmetic and the cell's clean hands, 14 claimants and staff, dead at the association hall, 1 paymaster's pen, set down, and the entries without prices, carried forward as they would be carried forward now for as long as the keeper of the book drew breath. The publication began at dawn, Veloa time, because Halloran had asked Marsh where the sphere's clock should be set for it, and Marsh had answered without hesitation. The account opened at Harrow Gate. It gets read there first. The repository went onto the open nets in its entirety, not curated, not redacted, exactly as a human signature in a garden had guaranteed, indexed by species, by century, by instruction, with Tavesh's chain of custody certifications appended to every cradle manifest so that no government in the sphere could call any page of it forged, without indicting its own registry science. 300 years of subtraction in the office's own hand. The Aldevar read the instructions that had ended their reform century. The Hollow Reach clans read the falsified plague advisories that had cleared their migration moons. The Saren themselves, this was the part no analyst had predicted, though Marsh had stopped being surprised by it the night Krev pressed his seal, into the margin, read 41 instructions executed against Saren citizens, because the instrument had never distinguished between foreign noise and domestic, and the reasonable officers had subtracted their own with the same gray diligence. For 11 days, the Concorde did not have a government so much as a wound. 3 client species suspended their compacts within the first 30 hours. The High Council convened in permanent session, and the Office of Stillness, which had seats in that chamber under 4 polite euphemisms, found all 4 chairs withdrawn by a procedural vote that took 6 minutes and 300 years. On the 12th day, the Concorde's chancellor stood in front of the sphere's assembled press and did the only thing the arithmetic still permitted. She asked Earth for terms. The terms had been drafted for months, because Earth's daylight campaign had always been the same campaign as Marsh's dark one, 2 columns of a single ledger, and Halloran flew to Valoa to deliver them herself with Plumb Line holding station overhead. Visible at dusk from the port like a second horizon, Earth did not ask for territory beyond one exception, did not ask for the Concorde's dissolution, did not ask for reparations calculated to cripple the disproportion, and every chancellery in the sphere remarked on it, some with relief and some with a colder understanding, was aimed at a single organ with a precision that made it more frightening, not less. The Office of Stillness to be dissolved by Concorde Constitutional Act, its doctrine struck from the college curricula, its college closed, its budget lines abolished in the open, its surviving officers individually adjudicated, not purged en masse, tried, each on the instructions bearing their seals in open court, with counsel. The dissent registry to be unsealed and read into the record, so that every officer who had objected into the void would have the objection counted, for them or against. The free port of Valoa to pass under joint trusteeship, with the Harrow Gate enclave itself ceded outright to Earth in perpetuity, 1 kilometer of ground, the only territorial demand of the entire settlement, as a memorial protectorate under the Survivors Association's governance. Indemnities to the families, the figure set not by Earth but by the claims actuarial tables that Benedict Ossi had been building the day the drone crossed the exclusion line, adopted unamended under his name. And 1 clause that the diplomatic historians would argue over for a generation, the clause Marsh had written in his own slanted hand into the draft Halloran sent back to the council, the clause that made the settlement an instrument instead of a punishment, an obligation binding on Earth equally with the Concorde, that no signatory shall maintain any service, office, or instrument whose function is the unattributable subtraction of persons, and that any signatory's citizens may petition any signatory's courts to enforce this article, in daylight, on the record. You wrote us into the cage too, Halloran said, the night before signature, in a commission office above the port with the fleet rising past the window. It was not entirely an objection. That was the price of the book, Marsh said. Krev asked me whether the next 3 centuries get a better instrument or a bigger one. The honest answer was that Earth hadn't decided, so I decided. If we build a still of our own in 50 years, some clerk's grandchild on Valoa can take us to our own tribunal with this campaign as precedent. Every folio, every receipt, every variance. That's what the mandate was for, Enos. Not deniability deferred, jurisdiction stockpiled. He slid the gray ledger across the table to her, the way she had slid Veil 9 across a table in Vigo 2 years in a hollowed life ago. The account is ready for audit. The Concorde signed. The Sphere watched the Chancellor and the Terran, first Secretary press seals into the instrument of Valoa at a table set up in the open air, in front of the chain fence, because Edith Moore had refused to allow the ceremony anywhere the dead could not be said to witness it, and no one had possessed the standing to overrule her. Plumb Line fired the only shots of its deployment that evening, 2,200 hulls, in formation above the port, discharging their point defense batteries simultaneously into empty sky. Once, a single sphere-wide concussion of light that the fleet's dispatches logged as a salute and every species watching understood as a sentence. This is what was waiting, and you will spend the rest of history glad it was never needed. The tribunal convened 6 weeks later inside the fence of Harrow Gate, in the enclave's old assembly hall, scrubbed and reconsecrated by the Survivors Association, beneath the dead black towers of the habitation ring, and it sat for 11 months. Earth had wanted human judges in the minority and got them. 2 human jurists, 2 Concorde civil magistrates of the bench that had arrested Sin, and a president from the Aldevar, whose species claim against the office predated humanity's spaceflight. Edith Moore served as tribunal recorder, the docking supervisor's flat, unhurried voice reading each instruction into the record, name by name, 6,212 times at the trial's opening, 11 days of names before a single argument was heard, and the Sphere's news services carried all of it. And the phrase the Valoa reading entered 36 languages, as the new word for the moment. Power is made to say out loud what it did. Immersen testified for 19 days without immunity and was sentenced on her seal to 20 years, the tribunal noting both the dissent in the void channel and her statement, entered without coaching, that the void channel was itself the crime she most required punishing for. Sirek Val was convicted on his finding. His lecture answer played in open court against the work logs and drew 30 years. He asked to serve them in a records conservation unit, and the tribunal, in the only moment of dark wit it permitted itself, granted the request. Ontavish, Seal 5, pled guilty to his seal before his own evidence was reached, refused the mitigation brief his counsel had built on the wardship instruments, and was sentenced to 7 years, suspended into supervised service as the tribunal's own chief registrar of evidence, the sphere's first convicted war criminal to certify the archive convicting his colleagues, which the gray prose of the old office could never have imagined and the new daylight required. Inquirer Ulshan Krev surrendered his commission on the courthouse steps on the first morning, testified as the prosecution's foundational witness for 2 months, then stood for adjudication on his own 41 years and was acquitted on every instruction, the registry showing, seal by seal, that he had never once signed one, and convicted on a single count he had insisted the prosecutors include obstruction by fidelity for the color and reassignment refusal, and a career of correct procedure in service of the instrument. Sentence, time considered served, and a permanent bar from intelligence work in any polity, which Krev told the bench was the first protection any government had ever granted him. Ubben Sorel was tried last alone on the authorship of Instruction Veil 9, and his defense was the repository itself. 300 years of precedent, every prior first clerk's instructions entered by his counsel to establish that the burn was the institution, functioning as designed, that he was a hand and the hand was old, and that to convict him was to convict the design which was, the prosecution agreed in its closing, precisely the point, and precisely what the tribunal then did. The judgment, read by the Aldevar president, while the accounting season's pale light came through the assembly hall's new windows, convicted the man and the design in the same paragraph and sentenced Sorel to life to be served on Valoa in the trusteeship's custody in a facility whose statute required that his cell's single window face the habitation ring he had rendered permanently quiet. He never spoke at sentencing. The gray prose had no passive voice left to hide in. The cell came apart the way good cells do, which is to say completely, and on schedule and with a grief nobody named. Thiel went back to the money, but the daylight kind seconded to this trusteeship as comptroller of the indemnity fund, where she spent her days making sure OC's tables paid out to the last decimal, and her evenings, Marsh suspected, checking the Concord's budget for the seedling shapes of new gray buildings. Wren returned to the vineyard with a prosthetic hand he claimed was better at pruning than the original. Pohl burned her legends, all of them, in a municipal incinerator in Vigo with Quill standing witness and receiving the ashes, and then went to teach document science at the tribunal's new registry school, where her first lecture was titled, "The Paper Always Wins." Iskra stayed dark the longest, decommissioning the collection architecture node by node, and surfaced a year later as the trusteeship's communications director on Valoa, where part of his statutory duty was operating the memorial light on the fence, which he kept, he wrote to Marsh, on a maintenance schedule of his own design, audited monthly, because some system should never again fail quietly. Hadid filed her medical logs with the tribunal, every treatment from Kareva to the crypt, and went home to Ceres, and sent Marsh one message on the anniversary of the Gray Sea off Dremel's world. Every year, 4 words never varied. He asked, you answered. Quill's final act as paymaster was the campaign's terminal account, presented to the council's audit office in person. 611,000 marks, 491 receipts, a variance ledger with 7 entries that no column could convert, and a 1-line cover memorandum that entered Earth's institutional folklore the day it was declassified. All sums accounted for. The cost was as stated. The price was higher. Pay it again if you must, but never carelessly. Marsh refused the decoration. He did it politely, in writing with a counter-proposal, and because the campaign had made him briefly the most quietly famous human alive, the council swallowed the refusal and granted the counter instead, that the decoration citation, whatever it would have said, be replaced in the honors registry by a single cross-reference to the public record of the campaign, folios 9-1, unabridged, so that anyone who went looking for the hero would find instead the account. The medal itself, struck and never awarded, went into the tribunal's evidence annex at his request, catalogued by Tavesh between a fire-stained claims ledger from the Association Hall and a child's festival lamp recovered from the enclave's eastern gate, where the curators placed no card explaining the connection, because the visitors who needed it explained had not been paying attention. He went back to Vigo in the autumn, 2 years and 4 months after a document with 9 seals had been slid across a table to him 3 times, and he reopened the shop 2 streets up from the chandlers, and the town, with the magnificent discretion of ports everywhere, asked him nothing. He repaired clocks. His hands, which had signed 11 authorizations and 1 guarantee, relearned the pivots and the escapements and were steady, which he had not expected, and the steadiness itself went into the other column, the last entry he ever made there, because he had finally understood what the column had been recording all along. Not what the work had taken from him. What the work had revealed him to be, a man who could keep the books of a thing like this and remain a man who kept books, who had hollowed where others would have burned, and whose hollowness had turned out to be the load-bearing structure of the whole campaign. The space where rage would have lived was where the record had lived instead. And the record, not the rage, had ended the office of stillness, and the record, not the rage, was what the dead had actually been owed. Vengeance had emptied him, and the emptiness had held the evidence. He could live with that arithmetic. On most days he believed it. On the others he opened the shop early and worked on the oldest movements he could find, the ones where every repair began by undoing some earlier craftsman's confident mistake, and that was its own kind of belief. The gray ledger he kept for 1 more year, through the tribunal's final judgment, through the Dissolution Act's ratification, through the first Valoa reading of the names on the massacre's anniversary, broadcast now on the Memorial Light's own channel to anyone in the sphere who chose to listen. And the audience metrics, Iskra wrote, grew every year, which neither of them knew what to do with, except be silent at, together, across the distance. Then, on the 3rd anniversary of First Reign, Gideon Marsh traveled to Valoa for the only time after the trial, walked up to the chained fence that was a fence no longer. The trusteeship had replaced the chains with a gate, and the proof tape with a registry of visitors, and the silence with a working archive, and deposited the campaign ledger, both columns, the priced and the priceless, into the Harrogate Memorial Collection, into Edith Moore's broad hands, under a deed of gift with one condition, that it be shelved, not with the histories of the war, but with the enclave's own recovered account books, the dock rosters and the school fees and the festival budgets of 6,212 people who had kept honest books in a sphere that had planned to delete them, so that anyone who came looking would find Earth's answer filed where it had always belonged. As one more ledger in a community of ledgers, the last entry ruled off, the account closed, and underneath the closing line in a small slanted hand, the only epitaph the campaign ever got or needed. Paid in full? In the only coin they understood, everything written down. Moore shelved it herself that afternoon while he watched. Then she walked him to the gate and shook his hand and said, in the flat, unhurried voice of the docking floor, 3rd shifts rostered at 6. Some of the new dock hands are the claimants' kids. They sign in under the memorial light, and the port pays them on time, and nobody calls it luck anymore. She nodded once, past him, at the towers where the windows were being reglazed one by one as families chose to. Return. That's what your book bought in the end, not the dead made right, the living made expensive. Marsh looked up at the ring of Harrogate, half black and half bright, the daylight moving across the new glass, and found that the hollow place had stopped asking to be filled. It had become what a good ledger always becomes when it is finally closed and archived and shelved within reach. Not a wound and not a weapon. A reference. He thanked her and signed the visitor's registry like anyone else, and caught the evening shuttle down the coast, an old man with empty hands going home to his clocks, while above the port, on the fence that was now a gate, the memorial light burned through its audited maintenance schedule. And across 40 worlds, the gray prose of the Office of Stillness sat in the open, shelves of every public archive in the sphere, misfiled by no one, deniable by no one, quiet at last in the only way Earth had ever intended. On the record, in daylight, where everyone could see it, and where by binding statute on the species that had written the answer as well as the species that had written the crime, everyone always would.